Well, thank you, Minister, and I think you've raised some interesting points, and your view about security of the national energy market, I think, would be shared by everyone. We do have time for some questions, and there will be microphones coming across. If you do have a question, please indicate. But I'm going to take the first one because I've got the microphone at the front. And it is this, Minister. You are the latest Minister responsible for energy. Will you become the bold minister and introduce a genuine debate around nuclear energy to provide ongoing security and, importantly, of course, pretty clean sort of energy, given, and here's a wrap for South Australia, their decision to be the repository of nuclear waste?
Mm-hmm. Well, a few points. Firstly, the Finkel review is not looking at the merits or otherwise of nuclear power, even though Alan has spoken about it. Indeed, in my maiden speech in this place, I said we had 44% of the world's uranium reserves, and it was quite a curious thing that we don't use it ourselves, right? So we export it to the world, and as you know, more than 75% of France's energy comes from, my mum gets in trouble with the way I say this, nuclear power, right? She tells me off for the pronunciation. She says I'm engaging in Bushisms. I don't know what that means, but
As long as they're not Trumpism.
Yeah. Well, that would be a different form of language. We have all this uranium. In fact, 3/4 of Australia's uranium sits in South Australia, ironically, and we export it to the world. France uses 75% of their power comes from nuclear. America is about 20%. Countries in our region, China, India, are heavy on nuclear power. Japan, after Fukushima, has reassessed and went back to more gas, but they are investing in upgrading at about $1 billion a plant, their equipment, so they can get nuclear power up and running. So it has proven to be a safe and, as you say, clean form of energy. Now, I've said publicly Jay Weatherall should be congratulated for calling this Royal Commission, and it was conducted by former Rear Admiral Kevin Scarce, who's a very decent person, former Governor of South Australia. Mm-hmm. And in my previous portfolio, I had the issue of dealing with the storage of Australia's low-level and intermediate waste. And so I had a lot to deal with Kevin Scarce and South Australia on that, because we asked we had an open nomination process, and we got very close to identifying a site for the storage of low-level and intermediate waste, which Australia's been building up and storing around 100 places around the country. So I was watching this debate very carefully. Now, when it came to turning uranium into power, that is a different issue than storing the waste. And the Royal Commission didn't talk about low-level and intermediate waste, and low-level and intermediate waste is the goggles and the gloves and the test tubes that come into contact with nuclear medicine, or it can be actually the insides of the reactor for storage. But it did talk about high-level waste and storing the rods that are being used from overseas and turning uranium into power and storing it here. And so that's an interesting debate, and we're waiting for the final report and we're waiting for the South Australian State Government to respond first, and that is in the portfolio of Matt Canavan. But it didn't recommend that South Australia move ahead with turning uranium into power. And the reason it said that was because the costs would be quite high, and there was also a question about the level of public support as well, and because there were other forms of energy supply. So I think we're a long way, as a way of getting back to your question, I think we're a long way from getting bipartisan public support for turning uranium into nuclear power in Australia. But I think it is a debate worth watching, and I do think that at least the issue of nuclear power and storage came up in the context of the South Australian inquiry.
Thank you, Minister.
Minister, and Andrew Dillon from AusNet Services. Thanks for your presentation. Great to have an insight into the important meeting on Friday, and very timely having you here today. You spoke a little about interconnection, and obviously there's been more of a focus on that after the events of a couple of weeks ago. One of the things we're keen to look at, and we've talked a little today about the links between competition and innovation and how those two can help drive each other. We have, unfortunately, in Australia, a situation at the moment where in most states, when we build an interconnector, there is no competition in the actual building and operating of it. Are you hoping to have Dr. Finkel look at that and see if we can deliver cheaper and smarter infrastructure in the years ahead?
Well, the answer is anybody can build an interconnector tomorrow, but nobody wants to build it out of their own money. They want to have it as a regulated asset. And that means they need approval from the AER. And the AER go through what is called a RIT-T process, which is basically a regulatory process to see is the cost commensurate with the benefit and who is going to pay and how much. And ultimately it's the consumer who pays. So anybody can put, if there is competition, I mean, anyone can go to the AER tomorrow and put up a proposal. One of the discussions we had at COAG, not this meeting, but the one in August, was about truncating the approval process so that it doesn't take years and years to get approval to build an interconnector. And so that's where my focus is going to be, and maybe Alan Finkel will look at that issue. I just want to say, though, that interconnectors are important, and greater connectivity is critical. But in themselves, they will not solve the issue around the stability of the system and the rise of intermittent power. For example, AEMO have pointed out that the interconnectors between South Australia and Victoria have gone down 4 times since 1999 due to what they call non-credible events, which could be, you know, a major shortage or an outage. Not an upgrade which has been scheduled or everything, just a complete outage. Now, in that event, South Australia becomes islanded and therefore becomes much more vulnerable to its heavy reliance on intermittent power, which is currently at 41%. So in June, July, on one day, the wind provided 80% of South Australia's power. But on another day in that period, it provided just 1%. And we had this real volatility in South Australia in July, and one of the contributing factors was that there was no wind. So even though you've got interconnectors, you can still have those interconnectors going out for technical reasons or otherwise. And if a state becomes islanded, then the likelihood of a region-wide blackout, in the words of AEMO, is highly increased. And so these are some of the real issues that we have to look at. How do we stabilise the system when intermittent power raises serious questions?
Just speak, they'll turn on at the back.
Hello?
Yep.
Hey, Matt Geck from the Queensland Productivity Commission. So over the last decade, electricity prices in Queensland almost doubled in real terms, and most of that was due to network investment costs, and much of that network investment was trying to improve reliability and security. With this review, and you've said that reliability and security is the #1 concern, will this review consider whether, I guess, the costs of more investment exceed the benefits, in that it may be optimal to have a possibility of blackouts on the odd occasion?
Well, we don't want blackouts on any occasion. About 50% of the household electricity bill relates to what are called poles and wires, and that's the issue that you're referring to in the transmission and the distribution. And that a lot of money has been spent, and you may remember successive governments talking about gold plating of the networks. Now, the body that gives the approval to this type of expenditure is actually the Australian Energy Regulator, and every 5 years the networks go before the AER with a specific ask, and the AER looks at their cost of capital, looks at their legislative demands, looks at the demands on the network, and projected consumption, and then makes a decision as to the adequacy of that. So that is an issue for the AER, which is independent of government. It's a part of the ACCC currently. So that will be a question for them, but energy security is vitally important, and we won't be compromising on that. But what has been one of our messages over the last few days is intermittent power does raise serious questions about the stability of the system. It's not a war on renewables. It's not, walking back from our 23.5% target. It's none of that. It's just saying there are big questions that have been raised by the independent experts as to what it means to have power that doesn't produce the quality or the quantity in the consistency of generation. That's the issue. It's a technical one, but it's a real one. And when 1.7 million people lose their power in South Australia, when the Port Pirie smelter now, Near Star smelter, hardens up because it loses power, and for the next 2 weeks they're trying to dig out the slag out of the smelter, and they can't run a business. Or when Arium, which is trying to be sold and keep those important jobs in South Australia, doesn't have full power, or Olympic Dam, which is a prized BHP asset, doesn't have its full power. That has serious economic consequences. And that's why the Prime Minister is absolutely right to say, let's take some of this ideology out of the debate. Let's put the practical first, and the practical is energy security, and that's what the ministers have agreed to.
Thank you. Thank you. Josh, you did raise the point that the towers fell down, say, looking at engineering standards. And we're not having a conversation about engineering standards, we're having a conversation about renewables. So what was your, and you're probably listening to experts talking about engineering standards and what needs to change. I'd be interested in your thoughts, what you heard from that conversation. And it's nearly like a vicious cycle of climate change is going to cause more extreme weather events, which is going to make our infrastructure more vulnerable, which is going to make it fall down and then cause these issues. So what was your take on the engineering standards that have to underpin our infrastructure?
Well, we actually got briefed at the COAG meeting about engineering standards, and that is something that the experts will continue to look at, because take Queensland, for example, they get Category 5 cyclones, and some of their infrastructure is hardened to withstand that. As you know, we had a pretty bad winds in Victoria yesterday, and thousands of people lost their power. But we didn't have a system black, right? And what happened here, and I have to say AEMO is still at the preliminary stage, and everything I've said publicly is that this was a weather-inspired event. If it wasn't for those winds, and if it wasn't for the lightning strikes, then we wouldn't have had the system black. But the work is still being undertaken. And what was interesting about South Australia is that there was a cascading effect across the grid. So you had 4 towers go out north of Adelaide, 3 which, as I mentioned, dropped 315 megawatts out of the system. Then there was a lightning strike on the Torrens gas-fired power station, which put it out. And as a result, because of the demand, there was a surge across the interconnectors, which then knocked them out. And that's why you had the whole state go into black. And we're asking the questions as to how could have that been prevented, and what other reforms do we need?
Thanks. Richie Farrell from Infigen Energy. Minister, when you were talking about the blueprint for the future energy security, given in sort of 20 years, 25 years' time, we'll have a very different energy mix in terms of generation. Have you provided Dr. Finkel, or will you provide him with guidance in terms of what mix of generation will be in the system at that stage?
Well, he will be looking at all those issues, but it is a blueprint for energy security. So his focus is how we're going to ensure that effectively the lights stay on as we transition to a lower emissions future. And our goal is 26 to 28% emissions reduction by 2030 on 2005 levels. And considering that the electricity sector is about a third of Australia's total emissions, it will be vitally important that we've got a good set of policies in that area. That's why we adopted the REP, but also that's why we're doing a 2017 review to effectively do a sit rep as to where we are in meeting those targets. It has to be said, renewable energy is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. And what's the end? The end is emissions reduction. And why is that important? Because we're dealing with the implications of climate change. So we need to find the best suite of policies that create that security and the affordability of the system in order to get there for our Paris targets. That's what we'll be looking at, and I'm sure battery storage and new innovative technology, some of which we don't even know right now, will form a big part of Australia's electricity market in the years ahead.
I have time for one final question, if there is one from the audience, given that the Minister has to get to Cabinet. I have down here. Thank you, Professor King.
Minister, Stephen King from Productivity Commission. I want to change it slightly and just ask, there's been a lot of discussion here about the supply side, about security of the network. What about on the demand side?
Sure.
A few years ago, everyone was getting excited about smart meters, about using real-time prices for consumers so that they would moderate their load. That also has emissions reductions effect. What's happened to all of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, that behind-the-meter stuff is really important. And by the way, when I was talking about energy efficiency, that's in demand, right? So if we talk about vehicle emissions, we're talking about reducing effectively the demand for carbon-intensive energy, and buildings and appliances and all that is on the demand side. In terms of in terms of what happened to the smart meters, Victoria is the only state which has rolled out smart meters across its jurisdiction. Now, it's fair to say they didn't do that very well, right? People were very worried about what was their cost, what would these people be able to know, who was controlling these things. It was a case of how not to do things when they rolled out the smart meters, which I think has made other states a bit shy of rolling that out because of what the consumer response will be. We had a discussion at the last COAG meeting on this, and we've agreed to task our officials to do more work, because it is absolutely key. Behind the meter is absolutely key. If you can even get different charges for using your energy at bulk at the busiest periods as opposed to the non-busiest periods, then that can make a very significant improvement to energy use. So, for example, if you've got an electric car, and that will become increasingly more pervasive, and you drive home from work at 5:30, you might just plug it into your battery then. But 5:30 may be the time everyone comes home, starts cooking dinner, and of course the demand on the system, which leads to the gold plating, means that the electricity price should be higher. But if you know that you can just plug it in your electric car into the socket and set it to charge at 2 in the morning when the demand is low, then that demand side response can lead to a significant reduction in energy usage and reduce the reliability, the likelihood that you will need the gold plating. And so that's just one practical example where demand side management can be very, very effective going forward. And I think this is where the states and the federal government, have different responsibilities. I can't mandate those rollout of the smart meters, even though I think they're a terrific way for going forward. And just one final thing I should say is when we think about renewable energy, you've got the large scale and you've also got the small scale. Now, we have a great story to tell on the small scale, what's happened in Australia. About 15% of Australian homes have solar panels on their roofs and hot water panels. That's the highest in the world on a per capita basis. Now, as a percentage of the overall grid, it's relatively small, but the potential for battery storage in the household is very exciting, and AGL have done some things with virtual towns where they're getting 1,000 homes to all be connected on renewable energy and then feed off each other so that they can store. So I think that this will be an area where we'll go ahead in leaps and bounds. So just to finish, Stephen, it is a very exciting space. There is a lot of innovation, but if, as the Commonwealth Energy Minister, the lights go out, nobody's going to be thanking me. In fact, they'll be sacking me. So that's why we're very unapologetic about the agreement at COAG last week, which is primary responsibilities, energy security and affordability. And while I should keep talking, I thought Obama in his State of the Union actually put it quite well. He said, if we're going to, move down this path of renewable energy and so forth, we don't have to convince, the freshmen on campus. He's convinced renewables are the future. Probably most of you are convinced. But who you have to convince is the family of the coal worker who is feeling that their job is threatened, and you have to convince the single mum with 3 kids who is working 2 jobs and who has seen their electricity prices increase and is thinking, do I keep the heating on for my kids or do I look for some alternative means? These are actually real life scenarios that energy policy involves, and that's why it's a very exciting area, and bringing it together with climate change means hopefully we can deal with it in a more effective way.
Well, Minister, thank you for that. I have a solution for your energy in Victoria. Just put a wind tower, only one, that's all you'd need at Docklands, where I live.
On the MCG, yeah.
I can guarantee you'll light up the world any day of the week. Minister, look, thank you so much for your attendance this afternoon and for addressing our delegates on such an important topic. Quite clearly, issues around South Australia, there are always lessons to be learnt. Importantly, though, the whole question about energy security and the review that's being undertaken at the moment is going to have long-term consequences for that energy supply in Australia. And secondly, of course, the other half of your portfolio responsibility dealing with the environment and climate change, these equally will play into the final decisions that you and your government will make. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank the Minister.